music had an intrinsic meaning and depth that was neither reducible to propositions nor could be destroyed by propositional objection.
Absolutely.
So you might say, well, the world is not meaningful. It's like, okay, what about music? Oh yeah, music is meaningful. Well, why? Well, I don't know. Can you criticize it? Well, I can, but it doesn't have any effect on the meaning of the music. And so the meaning of the music, which is part of its beauty, clearly, and that spiraling you talked about, Bach did that perfectly with the Brandenburg concertos, that continual Jacob's ladder spiraling that goes upward and upward, but in some sense returns to the same place. It's a brilliant example of that. But so tell me what gripped you about beauty philosophically and why you decided to focus on that in relation to values.
Well, I'm afraid I'm rather comprehensive in this book, which is why it's so long. So I do look at the various, at least the three most important values to me, which are goodness, truth, and beauty. And whatever Keats, who was a very fine poet, may have said about this, truth and beauty can't simply be equated. We wouldn't have two different words. And I'm afraid that sometimes beauty can be other than good and other than true. However, that's not to say that it always is. Often it is a pathway to something both truthful and very good. What you say about music is important because it suggests, a note has no meaning whatever. Put several 100,000 together and you've got Bach's St. Matthew Passion. How does that happen? It's entirely to do with the relationships between the notes, which make the harmony, make the melody, and make the ictus of the whole thing. So that's a very important part. And as you say, it can't be reduced to reason. It's not for that reason irrational. I think we need to make a distinction between things that cannot be encompassed by reason, but are not for that reason irrational. They may be transrational.
Or epiphenomenal. People like Pinker, one of the things I take issue with Pinker and those cognitive scientist types often is that they attempt to reduce the realm of the cultural, including the realm of beautiful, to like a cognitive spandrel, right? They're side effects of our cognitive ability. And that seems to me to be putting the cart before the horse. Because
absolutely.
Beauty
I think somewhere Pinker says that music is a useless exaptation of speech.
Exactly.
And he compares it...
Kind of the other way around, actually.
Compares it to pornography and cheesecake. But anyway, we don't need to waste time on that. Why do I find beauty so very compelling? Partly because of the part it's played in my life since my teens, the extraordinary power for me of poetry and art and music, to which I've more or less devoted a large part of my life. In a very, I'm not making a big claim, I'm not a creator, but they have guided my life. And they've also guided me towards the sense of the sacred. I think that if you listen to certain kinds of music, it's rather inane to say, to reduce it to, well, it's attractive in certain ways. It is, but there's a certain kind of music, and I think particularly of the 100 years of the great polyphony of people like Palestrina, Victoria, Bird, Tallis, Lassus, that simply cries out for another category to be brought to bear on it, namely that of the soul or the spirit. But it's greatly exaggerated that it's somehow a cultural artifact. So, for example, we know that Norwegians who know nothing about the structure of Indian music, nonetheless, can say what the meaning of certain passages in a raga, what that meaning is, and it will cohere with what an Indian intended by playing that piece. And, it's very obvious that we find Oriental art staggeringly beautiful. Our museums are full of it. And our museums are also full of people from the Far East coming to visit them. They don't think that somehow it's ugly because it's not part of their tradition. One of the most moving things that I've seen, I just want to say this because I hope that some viewers will look it up. There's a piece on the internet of an Amazonian tribesman being shown a film by a French film crew of snapshots, as it were, or little short clips illustrating our way of life. And they express horror at what we do to trees, what we do to animals, what we do to our elderly, how we have no respect for the sacred in the cosmos, all these things. And then there is this absolutely electrifying moment when they play Maria Callas singing Casta Diva from Bellini's Norma. And suddenly they all fall silent, and something that has never happened before happens. One of the young men stands up and moves towards the camera and says, "This is not our culture, but we feel there is something very special and beautiful in it." And then an old man says, "To me, it is overwhelming. I feel that it is divine or sacred." So I think that is quite extraordinary, and it gives the lie to the idea that these things are simply made up anyhow by a culture.
Nous leur avons proposé de réagir à des images de notre monde dont ils se méfient tant. Nous leur avons montré le pire et le meilleur. À l'heure où le soleil était le plus haut, ils nous ont invités à nous réunir dans la case des hommes, interdite aux femmes.
Vous aviez déjà vu ces images?
Non, jamais.
Est-ce que vous saviez que l'homme blanc était allé sur la Lune?
Oui, on en a entendu parler. Mais pourquoi vous êtes allé là-bas? Qu'est-ce que vous êtes allé chercher là-bas? Quel intérêt pour les humains d'aller là-bas?
Et qu'est-ce que ça vous fait? Quelle impression ça vous fait qu'un homme ait pu marcher sur la Lune?
Nous, ça nous inquiète. La Lune a été créée pour être loin de la Terre, pour ne pas qu'on y touche. La Lune est là pour nous éclairer la nuit. Autrefois, il n'y avait pas autant d'éclipses. Vous avez dû la déranger. Nous, ici, on a remarqué des changements. On a de plus en plus chaud. Il y a moins d'air frais qu'avant. Avec votre technologie, vous allez tuer la Lune.
Ça, ce sont nos jardins. C'est le jardin à la française. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ce jardin-là, vous qui êtes habitué à votre forêt?
Ce n'est pas bien ce que vous faites à vos plantes. Vous leur faites mal en les taillant comme ça. Pour nous, les plantes ont un esprit. On n'a pas le droit de les traiter comme ça. Tailler un arbre, c'est le faire souffrir.
Nous, quand on doit les arracher pour faire une plantation de manioc, on a de la peine.
Ces plantes que vous coupez et cisaillez, si vous ne les arrosiez pas, elles mourraient certainement.
Vous savez ce que c'est, ça? C'est la neige. Dans les pays froids, tombent des morceaux blancs, très glacés, et après les hommes glissent dessus. Ok. Ça, c'est la guerre des Blancs. Voilà comment les Blancs font la guerre. Vous en pensez quoi? Vous qui avez encore vos flèches et vos arcs.
Nous, quand on tue un animal, on a de la peine. Vous imaginez alors un humain? Vous tuez pourquoi? Pour manger? À moins que ça ne fasse partie de vos coutumes.
Pourtant, vous, les tribus, vous êtes fait la guerre entre vous.
Bah oui, mais c'est pas pareil. Vous, les Blancs, vous faites la guerre pour prendre quelque chose sur cette terre. Pas nous.
C'est vrai que nos ancêtres aussi se battaient entre eux, comme il l'a dit. On nous volait un enfant ou une femme. Un peu plus tard, on attaquait la tribu avec nos arcs et nos flèches pour voler un enfant ou une femme. Mais sans tuer toute la communauté, ni tout détruire comme vous le faites avec vos bombes. Ça n'a rien à voir, c'est une forme de troc. Tu me voles, je te vole. D'ailleurs, ceux qui faisaient la guerre, c'était surtout les Indiens cannibales.
Vous connaissez, lui? Le chef, il le connaît?
Non, on ne le connaît pas.
Zidane, c'est un joueur français qui est un des plus grands joueurs de foot au monde. Je voulais savoir si Zidane allait jusque dans vos tribus. Ben non. Et vous le connaissez, lui? Vous savez qui c'est?
Michael Jackson.
Comment vous le savez?
Je l'ai vu une fois à la télé à la ville.
Il y en a combien qui le connaissent? Les vieux le savent?
Non, on ne le connaît pas. Jamais entendu parler.
On dit que c'est la première star planétaire. On dit que n'importe quel endroit dans le monde, quelqu'un connaît Michael Jackson. Donc même dans votre tribu, les jeunes le connaissent. C'est le 11 septembre, 2 avions qui rentrent dans des tours à New York. Quelqu'un veut réagir?
C'est comme les mauvais sorciers chez nous. Ces gens n'ont de pitié pour personne. Les gens qui ont fait ça n'ont pas de cœur. Ils ne savent même pas qui ils tuent.
Voilà, c'est ce qu'on fait de nos personnes âgées. Très souvent, en France, lorsque les personnes sont trop âgées, on les met dans des hospices, dans des maisons, sans leur famille, sans leurs enfants. Qu'est-ce que vous faites de vos vieux, vous?
Pour nous, nos vieux sont sacrés. Nous nous occupons beaucoup d'eux, nous ne les abandonnons jamais. Ce sont nos ancêtres, nous les accompagnons. On les soigne jusqu'au bout. Il n'y a pas d'endroit pour les vieux ici. La famille s'en occupe jusqu'à la fin.
Nous devons nous rappeler de tout ce qu'ils ont fait pour nous, de la naissance jusqu'à notre vie d'adulte. Ces images me rendent triste. Ça n'arriverait jamais chez nous.
Nous, en France, lorsque on veut dire à une femme qu'on l'aime, on l'embrasse sur la bouche. Vous faites ça aussi, vous?
Chez nous, jamais on ne s'embrasse sur la bouche. On se parle, on apprend à se connaître, et ensuite on voit si ça se passe.
Comment vous dites à une femme que vous l'aimez? Quel geste vous faites pour qu'elle comprenne que vous l'aimez?
On prend une femme dans nos bras, on la caresse. Si elle se laisse faire, c'est bon. Sinon, elle nous repousse.
En Occident, nous, on a été obligés d'inventer ce médicament pour pas avoir d'enfants. Vous connaissez ça?
Nous n'avons pas besoin de prendre de médicaments. Nous avons ce qu'il faut dans la forêt. Nous avons même des plantes qui permettent d'avorter en tout début de grossesse.
Dans une partie du monde, les femmes sont habillées comme ça.
Leurs maris doivent être très jaloux. Elles n'ont pas trop chaud?
Vos femmes vivent nues, qu'est-ce que vous ressentez devant ces voiles?
Et comment elles se lavent? Elles doivent rester comme ça, à l'intérieur de leur maison? Elles ont le droit d'enlever les vêtements ou pas?
Après tout, si c'est leur culture.
Nous avons beaucoup de respect pour les chanteurs qui, comme elles, ont le courage de chanter seuls face aux autres. Quand le public écoute, il ressent cette solitude.
Et les jeunes guerriers, qu'est-ce qu'ils en pensent de la calasse? Il y en a un qui répond?
Moi, je vais parler au nom des jeunes. Cette musique, ce n'est pas notre culture. On ne sait pas ce qu'elle signifie. Nous, on ne peut que regarder et écouter. Mais elle nous touche.
Je trouve ça bouleversant. Sans la comprendre, on sent qu'il y a quelque chose de sacré.
Je vous vois tous très beaux avec vos coutumes, avec vos rites. Est-ce que vous n'avez pas peur, lorsque vous voyez ces images du monde, d'être mangé par ce monde, d'être englouti par ce monde?
Bien sûr que nous sommes très inquiets. D'ailleurs, si on vous a permis de nous filmer, c'est pour que vous montriez aux Blancs qui nous sommes.
Nous sommes très angoissés pour l'avenir de nos enfants. Mais quelle sera leur vie? On sent la pression de l'homme blanc qui monte tout autour de nous et de notre forêt. Et que vous le vouliez ou non, nous résisterons. Et nous nous battrons pour que vous ne souilliez pas notre terre.
I just finished listening to Jordan Peterson talking to Ian McGilchrist. And it was a very interesting conversation, because they highlighted a lot of things that I had been thinking about, writing about, and talking about lately, and including this this idea of imagination, how useful it is in understanding things about the world. And I took it more, I went a little. I didn't try to be super scientific with my essay, but it was more just supposed to be thought provoking. And then they also touched on this idea of music, which came up in the previous conversation with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot on Jordan Peterson. And I spoke in my little commentary on that, the little bit that I did, about how, there's this this idea that babies can develop perfect pitch if they are exposed to enough music that has enough variety in it and complexity, because the language learning part of their brain thinks that it's a language and starts learning it that way, and then they can recognize absolute pitches as the way that we would recognize words or letters or something like that. And I talked about how, you could map those things onto a language like English, because you have letters like alphabets. But I was really thinking about the fact that, when they were talking about how speech is not something that came out of music, or music didn't come out of speech, or however they were saying it, but that music is the greater thing. And it's interesting that Peterson brought up the Tower of Babel as well, because that was my thing, is that I think that it's very likely that if there was one language before the Tower of Babel, it would not necessarily contain everything that's in modern language, because we know modern languages have developed greatly. But there are different fragments of how language work that could have been present in that one language, and a musicality to it is definitely part of that. And they were talking about, we do seem to understand that there's an emotional content to music, and so we see it as a way to express emotion, and I think that also kind of goes with the idea of meaning. Meaning and emotion, that's part of what is expressed in music. But really what it seems to me is that music is like a language where we've forgotten the grammar or the rules of it or something. We make rules for music. This works better than that and all that sort of thing. But we don't understand what is really being meant, I should say. And even I would say, this is a difficult thing to put into words, but this is kind of what struck me after I did my other talk about it. A narrative, narratives and propositions perhaps could be expressed through music, but we don't know that language well enough to do it. And and it's really in a lot of ways it's similar to the way you can imagine that people who spoke different languages would have to communicate through something like pointing and gesturing, and then, which is a visual thing, and then somebody would start drawing pictures to talk about specific things or something that wasn't there to point to, and that could develop something like hieroglyphics. And I think with music, it's almost like the same thing. We can communicate through music, but we have a very difficult time getting a lot of direct information from it without some sort of a visual aid to go with it. Where if we do add that, it's very clear what the meaning is. Or you could say that the music can add a lot of meaning. We don't even notice this necessarily within movies, where the scores are often very subtle in a lot of ways, but they're there. And if you took it out, you would probably think this is weird and something's missing. But perhaps the music itself could communicate the full message, but we only have a partial understanding of it. But the fact that a baby's brain identifies it as a language and it processes it in the way where native language is acquired really points to the fact that there is something there. And I was also kind of thinking about this in terms of mathematics. And I watched the most of the video between Karen on the meaning code and I forgot his name, but the guy, he was from Cyprus, and he was talking about this monster group of math, which honestly I couldn't really. I was listening to it on my phone, and so after the part where they were talking about his story and all that, it was a little bit hard to follow, but I was working, so I just kept listening to it anyway. I didn't get to see all the pictures, the numbers that go with it. But, and Karen also brought up in that conversation what Paul Vanderklay had shared about Oliver Sacks' book and these twins who had this sort of language of prime numbers. And they saw mathematics as in a totally different way than we do. They didn't do factors with it. They didn't have to add and subtract things. They just more or less read the numbers. But the numbers actually meant something to them, whereas we only think of the numbers as meaning something in a context. And, they had this thing where they would just talk about different prime numbers. They would just say a prime number, and they would just kind of go, oh, and they would think about it. And it was like, to them, they spoke this language of prime numbers, and they saw them as distinct things. And I think, we always just see numbers as kind of, it's a way to manage thinking about quantities and things like that. And it's, we don't think of the individual numbers as having any particular characteristics or uniqueness, but these twins did, and it almost makes you think of, well, I guess you could say in a sense, a parent looks at their children and they don't compare the children all the time. Sometimes they do, but I mean, comparing and contrasting, but they don't just say, oh, our second child is like the first child in these characteristics and different than these other ones, and that's the amount that they're unique. It's not like, creating characters in a role-playing game where you're just tweaking parameters and you could arrive at multiple people could arrive at the same character by picking the same attributes in the same amounts. That's not how people are. Part of it's that complexity of it. But I think, the way those twins are looking at numbers is almost the way that a parent looks at each of his children. You can't just distinguish between you can't just use them interchangeably in your way of thinking. They are unique, and the areas where they are similar is part of what makes them who they are. But it's this whole thing of the right brain and the left brain. You're a very bad parent if you only think about your children with your left brain, I guess you could say. And I don't think that most parents would do that. And so maybe that was the way these twins are thinking about numbers. And my thought of that was, in talking about this idea of imagination and what could be, and in the world to come, that those twins understand numbers in a way that almost nobody else does. And for the sake of society, it's not very useful or helpful. But God is the creator of numbers. And to God, each number is a unique thing, like one of his children. And when those twins, and it was sad to hear about how they kind of stopped using their gift and they split them up. But in heaven, they will be united, and I think that, this is where you get to the point of if somebody's a simpleton of some sort, the grace of God, and the fact that they saw such beauty in the creation that God made, specifically in this form of numbers, extends beyond their ability to adhere to a certain proposition that they couldn't really understand. So in a sense, those twins are the unique people who probably had a very difficult time understanding a narrative that would appeal to most of us, but they could read numbers in a way that is deeper than we can. And if narrative is not the right word, there's something deeper than narrative. Maybe you could just call it meaning, or it's whatever the divine attribute of reality is that God intended to create when He made all these systems. But that fundamental thing is what we see in narrative and what most people also see in music in a certain way, and what very few people, like those twins, saw in numbers, and I would say maybe more people see in mathematics, which is also often considered, in a sense, a language. That was something that Rebecca was talking about, how in Plato, mathematics was the prerequisite for doing science, because that was the language in order to be a philosopher. And so I just think about, these twins united in heaven and able to share with God, and God can enjoy with them the beauty of all these numbers that He created in a way that, if we're there for eternity, it doesn't mean that we're going to ever understand numbers the same way that those twins did. And, I think that speaks to maybe some of the special nature of what it means to be here embodied, and the experience and the knowledge and the things that we gain in this time of our life. So that that was kind of how I imagined those twins and how they kind of fit into this story. But then to think of the musical thing, it's like there is this thing that we just have like glimpses of it. It's almost like how we probably have words in our language that we just use, and we don't know the etymology of all of them. I'm saying as individuals, specialists in language might learn them. But there's so many words that we use all the time, and we don't necessarily stop and think of the meaning. And some of them could be totally strange, and especially when when a word has been imported from another language, you can use that word in the context of English, and it serves a function, but you never understand it the same way that a native speaker understands that word. And to me, this is part of the beauty of what is possible when we translate, for instance, the Bible from one language into another. And obviously, or I should say, from the original languages into every other language. There's going to be some areas where a word isn't quite the right word, and you could maybe add the Greek word or the Hebrew word in a transliteration, but which does have the effect of expanding that language with a new word. Now, people reading that book will use the context of the Bible to learn a new word and understand it. And if some amount of definition can be provided, it would be. And that is one way that the new language expands. But also, you could say, well, in this new language that we're translating the Bible into, there's a word that's not the exact word, but is very similar, and it has some difference. And you say, okay, we're going to translate this word into this other one. And there's some, and I've heard some Eastern Orthodox scholars talking about how that was a problem when it happened from Greek to Latin, because there wasn't some Greek words in Latin, and so they had to make a choice, and they made a choice, and the word that they chose to translate it to has a different meaning. Ultimately, there may be some similarities, but it wasn't perfect. And they were criticizing that, saying that was the wrong choice to use that word. But what happened because of that is that people who are the native speakers of Latin would read the Bible in Latin, see this word with their understanding of what that word meant, and apply it to what it was saying about God, or about how the world works, or how humanity is, or how reality is. And they didn't find it to be completely untrue or wrong. It was still coherent. And so what they've done by translating the word is not expand the language, but they've expanded the meaning of who God is and what his word says. And I believe that those meanings are already, God being infinite, those meanings are there. And they've just not been discovered yet. And you can go a whole long time not discovering something and never realize what you're missing. And that's kind of this activity of the left brain, I guess you'd say. And an interesting example of that is I found out that I believe it was the Incas. They never discovered the use of the wheel. They would sometimes roll things on the logs, but they never had wheels. And they never learned how to build arches. They just never thought of it. And they had all sorts of other solutions for problems where the Romans would have built roads for wheels and would have built arches to support things. And they did things in a totally different way. And for most of the tasks that you would deploy those devices, the Roman way of building roads with wheels and building arches was probably better. But there could be unique situations where the other solutions that the Incas came up with would have been more appropriate. And the Romans never thought of those ones, I guess. So, and it's kind of the same way with words and the meaning of words and things like that. And this is to say, there's not the postmodern idea of, infinite meanings and all that. It's correct to a certain point, but there's limits to it, because it would not be right to translate a word into a totally antithetical word. Although sometimes a word that's translated wrong, the meaning of the word will change because of the context. And I think you can talk about like the phrase, for example, of the Good Samaritan, where now the term Samaritan means a doer of good deeds, which is not what the original meaning of that word was. So the idea that I had in regards to this is that there's this thing where the left brain is always wanting to take what it can handle and say that everything else doesn't exist. And it wants to reduce the world into understandable, digestible little bits. And the right brain wants to see all of the wholes and the patterns and the uniting of the various things. And I think that something like music is one of those things that has that ability. Like in the Church Fathers, where they talk about music as this kind of like either worthless or evil thing, that it has like these powers to seduce the youth and draw them into wickedness and things like that. And to me, it sounds like a very left brain response to the subject. And, you know, it's kind of funny because I got into a little antagonism with Jonathan Pajot because of, which was maybe not the most charitable thing, but it's funny because I understand his testimony in a way where mine is like almost the flip side of it, because he left a more broadly evangelical, modernized type of church service and embraced the Eastern tradition because of the beauty of the artwork and the way that the symbolism and the iconography resonated with him. But, you know, for myself, like, you know, I play guitar and I play electric guitar, and I play it specifically in the way that you play an electric guitar differently than you do an acoustic guitar. And so that's a strong part of how God made me that resonates with the more modern forms of worship. So, you know, it's tough for me to see the inherent badness in that, which you know, some people do criticize. Not to say there isn't faults, but there's wonderful and terrible songs, lyrically, musically, spiritually, within the context of modern worship music. But, you know, music is one of these things that we don't have we don't understand all that it is communicating, and apparently math can be too. And then I was thinking just about the idea of like imagination and this sort of imaginative like storytelling, world building worlds in your mind, which that gives you something then to contrast the world that you see and interact with. And as you know, I've talked about in my big essay on this, in some ways those could be better, in some ways they could be worse, that contrast. But it does help, I mean, this is what they were speaking about, it does help you to see and understand and appreciate what's going on in our world. And, you know, imagining that rocks and trees had minds of their own and had a will and had the choice to make decisions, so that they would have preferences or not. You know, all these things will only enhance our experience of what is going on in the world around us. And then I was thinking about how, you know, we become aware of these things because of like great, you know, works of fiction and things like that. And this was the part that I meant to put in my big long essay, but I didn't. And it's just going to end up being a little shorter version, I think. But I was thinking about, you know, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and how everybody kind of is familiar with them, and this is the thing that you mentioned when you talk about how great works of fiction can draw us into the faith and the Christian tradition and help us to understand things in a more beautiful way, you know. And this is kind of like this concept of enchantment, and that, you know, there can be an unhealthy aspect to it when it becomes a LARP, but if it's done right and you're not just trying to live in the past or live in a fantasy land, but you're using that creative imaginative impulse correctly, it will bring more beauty and more unity and wholeness and wonder to everything that's going on in your life. And when I heard that story about those twins and how they experience the numbers and the weird way that we can almost conceptualize what it's like, how they understand numbers, but almost conceptualizing it is probably about as much as we can do. And then I was thinking about how, you know, Lewis and Tolkien, everybody has heard of, and they were fantastic writers and communicators. And I think because of their skill at writing and communicating, and their knowledge and expertise as professors, the books that they wrote are excellent, and they do a masterful job of drawing us in. But then I was thinking about, like, there's so many, like, crummier versions of those books, and people would say, like, oh, this is not, like, you tried to write the next Narnia, and it wasn't nearly as good. Now, it's impossible to, it's not to say it's not a worthwhile thing to do, because it could have some impact, but even if it has less of an impact on the people who read it, and less people do read it because it's not as excellent, I think we maybe forget the impact that doing something like that has on the person who's writing it. And I think, Tolkien and Lewis, both, they were not the same persons after they wrote their great works. And for Tolkien, he spent all this time developing, like, fully the languages and the world that he was crafting his narrative around, just to make sure that it was correct. Now, Lewis took a much more freestyle kind of approach to things, which I guess Tolkien was a little bit critical of. But, like, really, for whose benefit did Tolkien fully develop Elvish and Dwarvish and Orcish languages? It was not for the reader. Most readers can barely scratch the surface of comprehending them. And there's been many more authors who have invented fictional languages for their worlds, but if the vocabulary and the grammar goes much beyond the few places where it's quoted within the novel, that's probably an extreme rarity. So there was something in that process of creating languages, and I think in building worlds, that was the real imaginative experience for Tolkien and Lewis. And for them, that was their spiritual food. It was in the writing. And in that regard, I think every bad novelist probably gains something, even if they don't get a great feedback or a great response from other people, because what they did, writing a book shapes who you are. But even if you wrote a book that's not very good, like, that's still a specific and disciplined task. Whereas imagination is native to us all. And the thing that I think was really interesting is, when I was thinking about those twins, they understood numbers so much in such a deep way that it basically took up all their brain power, and they could barely function in any other way. And in reality, they probably understood fundamental things about numbers that the people we would call the greatest mathematicians in the world could not comprehend. But because that understanding takes all of their brain power, basically, they are left with almost nothing in which to communicate it. In fact, it really was only communicated because an observer who had a little bit of knowledge about prime numbers and things like that was able to spot what they were doing and comprehend it to a certain degree, and he was able to verify his assumptions by interacting with them with the use of his prime number book. So we just got a glimpse that this thing was possible. And in regards to writing and things like that, Lewis and Tolkien, it reminded me of this story that I heard, and I saw a documentary about this guy named Henry Darger, and he definitely had some sort of it was not an average way of thinking, because when he was very young, he was thought to be extremely bright, and he did really well in some areas of school, but he had a horrible home experience where his mother died in childbirth giving birth to his younger sister, I believe. And his father was not a very healthy man, and his father couldn't take care of the baby, so he gave the baby up for adoption. And eventually, because of his own health problems, he had to give up Henry, his son, for adoption as well. And Henry was really ill-suited to the conditions in the orphanages that he lived in. This was at the early part of the 20th century. And because of that, he was labeled a certain way, and he didn't have anybody who really understood him in his life. And like those twins, he ended up in a very menial task. You know, he's more high-functioning than they were. He had one friend. He kept a job as a janitor at a hospital for basically his whole adult life, and he lived there as a boarder. And nobody really thought much of this guy. He never married. Apparently, later it was discovered he probably didn't even know what a woman looked like with no clothes on. And he kind of lived this life that many of us say, like, wow, this is a really sad life. But when he passed away, people discovered that he had written several massive fantasy novels that were like thousands of pages or whatever in total. And along with that, he had drawn and painted and used collage and all these different various art forms to create illustrations for these stories. And he basically spent all of his waking energy and everything that he had, all of his money went into buying like art supplies and things like that. This was like, you know, the main focus of his life for 10, 12 hours a day, something like that, you know. And while he was working, I'm sure that his brain was just thinking about this. I know this from experience because right now I'm making a video that spiritually or intellectually is much more important than the things that I get paid to do. And that's how I spend a lot of my time working, you know, it doesn't take my whole brain to do my job, so I spend a lot of it thinking about deep thoughts. But, you know, if it was not for the fact of this discovery, this whole thing could have gone unknown, and no one would have ever heard of it, and therefore we would say, like, whoa, how could we even say it's of any value? But I think that, you know, for one thing, he was very religious, even though he had been harmed in great part by the Catholic orphanages and boarding schools he attended. He was still very devout in the Catholic faith, and the main impetus of his storytelling was he felt this great injustice that was done by enslaved and orphaned children. And part of that was that he was unsuccessful in his attempts to adopt and gain guardianship of his sister. And he was also very troubled by a story of a young girl who was murdered. And, you know, if it wasn't for the random events at the end of his life, we could have never known about this. But it wouldn't have meant that it didn't happen. And it wouldn't have meant that what he did through use of his imagination had no value. I would say it had tremendous value. And like those twins, I think that now he's in the presence of God, and he is basking in the undiluted love that resonates so strongly with what he felt in his heart, because the love for the unwanted and for the mistreated and the abused, that comes from God, and that was part of the nature of God that was specifically within Henry Darger. And now he is experiencing it more fully than he ever did before, But not only that, he is able to see how God brings satisfaction and conclusion and finality to those things that he strove against in his time here on earth. And so I think really, what we have to think of is that he was on the borderline. He wasn't a great writer. He was never, I think his books are published now. I think they're not the best because he didn't have schooling. He didn't have access to, people to share ideas with, the editing and all this stuff. But what he did on his own is an amazing achievement. And how many more people are there whose imagination level is even higher than that? And yet they, like those twins, perhaps don't even have enough brain space left over to communicate effectively. And why would God make people like that? But the thing is that he creates them not for our enjoyment, but for his enjoyment. And I think that if we consider that, if we let our right brain look at these individuals a little more, it could be a really good thing. And it could help us to have more compassion, like for people who are, who the world values not at all. People who are mentally handicapped, physically disabled, who have no means of communicating, who have no way to share their stories or what's going on in the richness of their mind. It doesn't mean that what's going on there is less than what's going on in our mind. It could very well be that what's going on in their mind is far greater than what we experience. So that was the main thought that I really wanted to get out from that. And I think I'm going to write a little bit and kind of further explore those details.